Today is a day of celebration. We're welcoming our new brother Parker into our church family. We're celebrating the promise God has given us. And we're praising God for extending the covenant promise to us and now to Parker. This is who we are, the people of the covenant, God's promises. The church. We live in the light of grace, of God's goodness and love. And we stand and we proclaim this grace even as the world carries on in the same self-destructiveness that has been going on since Adam and Eve chose their own way over God's. Sin is very present in this world, and sin has severe consequences. I confess sometimes it's hard for me not to be overwhelmed by the darkness in the world. I turn on the TV and I see stories about explosions and shootings and just stories of people so deep in darkness that they've lost their sense of connection to other human beings. Instead, they embrace senseless death and destruction. And sometimes the world itself seems to turn on us. Storms and floods ruin homes, and fires stretch the finances of families that are already trying to pay all the rest of their bills. And even our own bodies show signs of this darkness. Illness creeps in, and lives can suddenly be very, very different. And how many of us have heard a doctor give news about a loved one that seems impossible to accept? Where is God in these moments? What is God feeling, and why does God allow a world with so much darkness to carry on? Well, today we're going to look at Genesis 8. This is a portion of Scripture near the end of the flood story. But to set the stage for the passage, let's take a look at this scene from a few chapters earlier. If my thing works here. There we go. From chapter 6. When the Lord saw that man's wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every scheme his mind thought of was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Then the Lord said, I will wipe off from the face of the earth mankind, whom I created, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. What do you hear in those words? Sometimes people look at the Bible and they come away thinking that God is angry in the Old Testament. They point to stories like the flood and they say, how can this angry God of wrath be the same God we meet in Jesus Christ? And there is anger in these words. Yet, when we use angry words, a lot of times we use words that distance ourselves from people that we're angry with. But that's not what I see here. It looks like God is looking back at a time before the darkness, when things were the way they were meant to be. Mankind, whom I created. When I look at these words, I hear hurt and sorrow. God is just. God cannot tolerate a world with injustice and wickedness. So God must act. But we know the story doesn't end here. Noah, however, found favor in the sight of the Lord. So who is Noah? Why does God choose him out of all the people in the world? Actually, we don't have a lot of background on Noah. We don't have any Noah childhood stories. The first time we meet Noah, he's 500 years old. All we really know is that he was blameless among his contemporaries. We know he was married. He had 3 sons, and his sons had wives. And we know that he walked with God. Walking with God is something we hear over and over again in the Scriptures. What does it look like to walk with God? What I notice about Noah is that he obeys. With many people in the Bible, we see them question God. We see arguments, hesitation, doubts. But not Noah. Look a little later in chapter 6. God is speaking to Noah. Understand that I am bringing a flood. Floodwaters will destroy every creature under heaven with breath of life in it. Everything on earth will die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. You are also to bring into the ark 2 of all the living creatures." And the instructions go on. They're extensive. But when we get to the end of it, we hear from Noah, and Noah did this. He did everything God had commanded him. The one character trait we get to see in Noah during the flood story is that he is committed to the Lord. Are you like Noah? If someone were to read your story thousands of years from now, would they come to the same conclusion? We gather here week after week, and we sing songs of praise, and we speak words of commitment. This morning we did so again. We committed to come alongside Parker as he takes his first steps, as he goes through childhood, and as he travels on whatever journey God has planned for him. I was thinking about commitment quite a bit throughout the week as I was working through this passage, and on one popular website I found 3 entries for the word commitment. I'd like to share them with you. Number 1, commitment. Commitment is what transforms the promise into reality. It is the words that speak boldly of your intentions and the actions which speak louder than the words. It is making the time when there is none, coming through time after time after time, year after year after year. Commitment is the stuff character is made of, the power to change the face of things. It is the daily triumph of integrity over skepticism. Number 2, commitment. Something men are frequently afraid of. Proposal of this will most definitely end a relationship. So. Number 3, commitment. Sticking with something long after the mood you have set it in has left you. That's just it, isn't it? Commitment is easy in a moment of passion. But what happens when the feelings go away and when doubt starts to sneak in? What do you think it was like on the ark? Waiting for God to bring the flood to an end, to keep the promises God had made. We'll go to our chapter. Chapter 8. And God remembered Noah, as well as all the wildlife and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water began to subside. The sources of the watery depths and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky stopped. The water steadily receded from the earth, and by the end of 150 days, the waters had decreased significantly. The ark came to rest in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. So we know God remembered Noah, but it was a whole 7 months before the ark came to rest. What must it take to keep giving food to animals as the months slip by? No sign of land, and the ration grows smaller and smaller. Did Noah begin to doubt? We don't get to know. But I do think we get a glimpse of Noah's heart as the story continues and he begins to send out the birds. He needs a sign. He needs hope. Verse 5, the waters continued to recede until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were visible. After 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made, and he sent out a raven. It went back and forth until the waters had dried up from the earth. He sends out a raven first, and it flies back and forth. We see the raven often in literature. When you're watching a movie and you see a raven, what do you know? Well, when the severe-looking black birds fly across the screen, I feel a tightening in my chest. Something is wrong. There's something to be afraid of. There's death. When the raven cries, "Nevermore," We're not filled with hope. It starts to slip away. Noah has obeyed every step of the way, and yet it's hard to tell if the water's really going down. All he can see is a black bird flying back and forth over the destruction of God's wrath. Have you found yourself in this place? Maybe some of you are there this morning. You know God is in control, and you want to believe it. But as bad news seems to pile up, it becomes harder to cling to that hope. It begins to feel like God has forgotten. My wife told me I could share this story. Sonnet grew up in a strong Christian family. She went to a Christian school. She knew all the answers in Sunday school. When she was in the first grade, one of her classmates in Sunday school was diagnosed with leukemia. Sonnet was old enough to understand that she was seriously ill, but she knew what to do. She prayed. Every day. She prayed for her friend. She prayed to God to make her better. But God did not make her better. The young girl died. And Sonnet was devastated, confused. What do you do to pick up the pieces when it feels like God has forgotten? If you are in that place today, you're not alone. Look at these words from Psalm 143. Lord, hear my prayer. In your faithfulness, listen to my plea, and in your righteousness, answer me. My spirit is weak within me. My heart is overcome with dismay. I remember the days of old. I meditate on all you have done. I reflect on the work of your hands. Answer me quickly, Lord. My spirit fails. Don't hide your face from me, or I will be like those going down to the pit. Let me experience your faithful love in the morning, for I trust in you. Reveal to me the way I should go, because I long for you. If this connects with you today, I suspect you might be able to relate to Noah. Praying, hoping, waiting on the Lord to keep his promises. The story continues. Then he, Noah, sent out a dove to see whether the water on the earth's surface had gone down. But the dove found no resting place for her foot. She returned to him in the ark because water covered the surface of the whole earth. He reached out and brought her into the ark to himself. So Noah waited 7 more days and sent out the dove from the ark again. When the dove came back to him at evening, there was a plucked olive leaf in her beak. So Noah knew that the water on the earth's surface had gone down. This time, Noah sends a dove. What kind of things do you associate with the dove? Peace. Hope. Exactly. And even though the weeks keep slipping by, he keeps sending out the dove. And this time it comes back with an olive leaf. This is a symbol that we all recognize. It's a declaration of peace. Only this time it's not a declaration of peace between 2 warring nations. This is a sign of peace that God sends to Noah. He is sending him a sign of peace. After spending time in this story, I've come to the realization that this story is not about Noah. And it's not about animals. This is a story about a God who loved mankind, whom he created so much that he bestowed grace on one human family so that God could continue in the work of restoring the whole world. All the way back in chapter 6, we read that Noah found favor in the sight of God. This word is hain, just as easily be translated grace. And it's the first time it appears in the Bible, but it's not the last. Grace is the overarching theme of the entire scriptures. Over and over again, people choose sin. The world is always at war. Poverty and famine are always present. And even though there's nothing any of us can do to deserve it, time and time again, God offers grace and restoration. The story continues. After he'd waited another 7 days, he sent out the dove, but she did not return to him again. In the 601st year, on the first month, on the first day of the month, the water that had covered the earth was dried up. Then Noah removed the ark's cover and saw that the surface of the ground was drying. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was dry. Then God spoke to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out all the living creatures that are with you, birds, livestock, those that crawl on the ground, and they will spread over the earth, and be fruitful, and multiply on the earth." So Noah, along with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives, came out. All wildlife, all livestock, every bird, and every creature that crawls on the earth came out of the ark by their groups. The flood is over. Can you imagine what it must have felt like stepping out of the boat? Can you imagine that first breath of fresh air after all that time? Noah responds with worship. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. He took some of every kind of clean animal and every kind of clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, he said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, even though man's inclination is evil from his youth. And I will never again strike down every living thing as I have done, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease." The chapter ends with a promise from God, a commitment to preserve, to restore. God makes a covenant. And I find this enormously comforting. The promise is made purely out of God's grace and love for God's people. Look at these two verses situated at the beginning and the end of the flood story. If you look at it, in the first verse, we hear that every scheme his mind thought of, man, was nothing but evil all the time. And when we come to the end, it seems like not much has changed. Man's inclination is evil from his youth. God knows that the flood hasn't washed away sin for all time. He has another plan for that. Even so, God offers this promise, God's grace, to all generations. And in the next chapter, when God places the rainbow in the sky, it's not to remind us to obey, but as a reminder of God's covenant with the earth. God's promise to remember you. From chapter 9. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all future generations. I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I form clouds over the earth, and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature." God keeps his covenants, and God makes promises that extend to families, to descendants, to the whole creation, down to us today, every time we see a rainbow in the sky. There is darkness. There is winter. There is sadness. And there is death. But God has not forgotten. God remembered Noah. God is committed to the creation and to those who receive God's grace. That same commitment is revealed over and over throughout the Bible. God reveals that commitment once more today to Parker and to all of us. I believe this story is not about Noah. It's not about animals. It is about God's covenant with the creation, with God's people, with you. God remembered you, and so he caused a wind to blow over the surface of the water, and it began to recede. God remembered you. And so Abraham did not have to plunge the knife into the son who he loved. God remembered you, and so the waters of the sea parted, and the Israelites walked through on dry ground. God remembered you, and so a giant was felled with a simple sling and a stone. God remembered you. And so 2,000 years ago, a virgin gave birth to a baby and placed him in a manger. And when he was grown, even though he lived a perfect life, he took on the sins of the whole world and stretched out his arms and died on the cross for the sake of the people God created and called. God remembered you. And so the tomb is empty. God is committed to the restoration of God's people and the whole world, and it is our privilege as God's people to commit ourselves to that same restoration. Wherever you find yourself today, know this: God has not forgotten you. God cares for you more deeply than any of us can understand. Sin is still present, but it will not always be. God is at work in the world. Our passage promises that the sun will rise. The snow and ice must finally give way to spring. God's promises, the very rainbow in the clouds, gives us hope for tomorrow. God remembers you. And if your faith rests in Jesus Christ, who has already triumphed over sin and death, God has promised that you, child of God, will rise again. Will you pray with me? God of peace, we come to you this morning in awe and thankfulness for your grace, for your commitment to us. We confess that sometimes we are clinging to hope by the thinnest strands of faith, and we thank you that it is not our willpower that matters. Help us to lean on your grace and to live our lives as agents of hope to those around us. We thank you for your word, for revealing to us that sin and death have already been conquered in the death and resurrection of your Son, and for promising that Jesus will come again to set all things right. It is in his strong name that we pray. Amen.